All right, ladies and gentlemen, well, we've finally come to the anticipated chapter, at least I assume an anticipated chapter. Revelation chapter 20 is it definitely is a much talked about, much debated over chapter of the Bible, and much discussed and much debated over chapter in the book of Revelation. And if you're familiar with that portion of scripture, you know that we're dealing with the millennium, the 1,000 years, the 1,000-year reign of Christ. And perhaps you know the different perspectives on those. We'll go over that just a little bit. But in our study of the book of Revelation, we've now finally made our way up to this point. As I mentioned before, we're going to probably spend quite a bit of time in here. I mean, not too long, but longer than normal in any normal chapter. And the way that I explained it is, I think that that's going to be because we're going to need to do some deconstruction and then some reconstruction, just because of certain understandings that are probably not biblical about the millennium and that sort of thing. And I know that the millennium is a hot topic for some people. It's a hot button topic for some people. To be honest, I really don't know why, but it is. And so if you find that my view of the millennium is different from yours, I would ask you to, give this a fair listen. We're going to dig into scriptures a little bit. I'm going to pose some challenging questions, and I want you to legitimately think about them. And examine scripture, after hearing what I have to say after each of these episodes, and see where the Holy Spirit leads you. But our agenda for the next several weeks is going to be examining Revelation chapter 20, and so we're just going to now just kind of have somewhat of a, I guess, just kind of a. I don't want to call it an overview because it's not, but I guess we're just going to be dipping our toes a little bit into the text, and then we'll go do a deeper plunge next time, and then the following weeks. And you'll understand why I'm just dipping my toes in now, because there's certain things that need to be established and that sort of thing. But that's our agenda. That's what we're looking at doing. Starting Revelation chapter 20, talking about the millennium. I think it's going to be an interesting analysis. So I would encourage you strongly to stay with us. My name is Steve Gill, and you're listening to Loving the Scriptures. All right, Revelation chapter 20. We're going to be getting into it here in just a little bit, but I think you know what time it is. If you are a faithful listener, you definitely know what time it is. It is time for my shameless plug for my book, Signs of the End. What did Jesus say about his own return and the events that point to it? A book which goes over Jesus's words in the Olivet Discourse, Mark 13, Matthew 24, Luke 21. And even though there's the main focus of that book is the Olivet Discourse and what Jesus taught his disciples about the end of the age, there is quite a bit. It's near the end of the chapter that talks about the millennium. Okay, so if that sort of thing interests you as well, so I would encourage you to order a copy. Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. You can go to either one of those areas. As usual, I will put a link in the episode description so that you can click on it, go to the Amazon page, and then you can place your order. So I would strongly encourage you to do that, to order a copy of that book, read it, and be blessed. Also, just one other preliminary thing, and I don't know if this is going to be evident, from your side. I have no idea, but if things sound a little bit different, I'm in a different room. I'm recording this in a different room than I usually am. It's not as closed off. It's not, what's the right word? Acoustics friendly, maybe. Although I've tried to make that as much as possible. But just so you know, if the sound quality sounds a bit different. And again, I don't know if it will or not, or if it will, how much different it will sound. That's probably why, because I'm in a different room doing this now than usual. So if it doesn't sound, normal, or if it kind of puts you off, I apologize for that. But we'll work with this the best way that we can. So let's get into this whole thing with the millennium. Now, of course, going into Revelation chapter 20, we read about the 1,000-year reign. And usually we're talking about the 1,000-year reign of Christ and the 1,000-year reign of, the church reigning with Christ. And when we say the term millennium, I mean, the actual term millennium isn't what's used in Scripture. It's the millennium. That term is drawn from the whole concept of 1,000 years. Mille meaning 1,000, right? So the millennium, that's why we call it the millennium, in case you didn't know, is that this is the passage that talks about the 1,000-year reign of Christ. Okay, and so if you're, here's the thing. I understand that. That some of you are very aware of the millennium and the different millennium views, but there are probably maybe just as many who aren't. Okay, so just for the sake of making sure that we're all on the same page, I just want to do a quick, a very brief overview on the millennium, on the different millennial views. There's three of them. Okay, there's premillennialism, there's postmillennialism, and there's amillennialism. Okay, now probably the most dominant view on the millennium that most people, I would say most people hold in our culture today is premillennialism. And you've heard me talk about premillennialism before. You've probably heard me refer to the more specific brand of premillennialism called dispensational premillennialism. And that's the side that we're going to focus most on when we're making comparisons of these millennial views, is the dispensational, area of the millennium, because that's probably the one that's held the most, or at least that people are most familiar with because they've heard teachings of it, from a pastor or from a radio program or something along those lines. But basically with premillennialism, its basic understanding is that, well, first of all, you have chapter 19 with the second coming of Christ. Christ has come back. He's destroyed his enemies. And so in Revelation chapter 20, there's the binding of Satan, who's depicted as a dragon. We're going to see all that when we go into the text. And there is, Satan is thrown into the abyss, and he's locked away for 1,000 years, which results in, the church reigning with Christ for 1,000 years. During that reign for the 1,000 years, it's going to be 1,000 years of total and complete peace and righteousness. Now, I've heard some variations of how to understand the actual environment of the millennium from this premillennial lens. Some approach it in the whole idea is that there isn't going to be anybody who's sinning at all. I mean, so this is really going to be a totally excellent environment to live in, and people are still going to be, at least people who don't have glorified bodies at initially, at the beginning of the millennium, they'll marry and have children and things like that. So we're going to have a repopulation of the earth. The earth is going to be filled again. So you're going to have, some people with glorified bodies. Those are the people who were raptured before the tribulation and return with Christ at the beginning of the millennium. Those who in natural bodies are those who are tribulation saints. And so there's, this whole existence is going to be of total peace and righteousness, ruled by Christ from Jerusalem. And, so there's that one side where there's going to be total peace and righteousness because Satan is out of the way. There's others, though, who kind of express that there is the possibility of sin, but Any sin that's enacted is going to be squashed out immediately. It's going to be taken care of immediately by Christ himself. So really there isn't going to be any sort of long-lived sort of expression of sin during this 1,000 years. Most of what I've heard from the premillennial understanding of this is the former description, where you really don't have any sin at all. Okay, so it's 1,000 years of total peace and righteousness, where the church rules and reigns with Christ for 1,000 years. Then after that point, Satan is released from the abyss that he's locked into, and he deceives the nations. And so there's this big gathering of all the nations to come up against God's people, and then the people are swiftly defeated and done away with. And then that leads into the Great White Throne Judgment, and then going into chapter 21, the new heavens and the new earth. So that's kind of in its basic form, the whole, premillennial understanding of it. And so basically to get the pre in there, what we understand why they're called premillennialists is because is that it's saying that Christ returns before the millennium. Okay, so again, chapter 19, you have the return of Christ, and then you go into chapter 20, which is the earthly millennial kingdom. That's why there's the premillennial understanding of that, because Christ comes back before. Okay, on the opposite side of that, you have postmillennialism. And postmillennialism, again, with the designation, you understand that what they believe is that Christ comes back after the millennium. Okay, so after the 1,000 years is completed. Now, postmillennialism will look at the binding of Satan in a way that once he's bound, what you begin to see is that a large, widespread dispatch of the gospel. And a lot of people coming to Christ. And then with a lot of people coming to Christ, what results is in this 1,000 years is, it's almost along the same lines. I got to be careful here, because I don't think postmillennialists will look at it this way, but in some way it's almost along the same lines as the peace and righteousness that you see from the premillennial understanding. I don't think postmillennialists will say that it's total, complete peace and righteousness. But the effects of the gospel and people coming to Christ will definitely have a large, widespread, positive effect on the world. So much to the point that you have most people and governments and governmental systems and economic systems and things like that falling in line under the law of God. So basically, it's not going to be hard at all to find Christians around the world during this time. There's going to be widespread gospel success, along with political success, economic success, and that sort of thing, until the end, when Satan is released, and then there's people who are deceived. They mount a assault against God's people, and then they're destroyed when Christ comes back. And at the end of that, so that would be the end of the millennium, when Christ comes back to take care of his enemies. Okay, and so that's really what post-millennialism is all about. Okay, and then besides the premillennial understanding and the postmillennial understanding, there is the amillennial understanding. And the amillennial understanding, and let me just throw out there, just so there's no mistake or misunderstanding, because it's very easy to have a misunderstanding here. The alpha privative attached to the millennium would give people the understanding that amillennialists don't believe in the millennium, and that's not entirely true. Amillennialism is basically the alpha privative that negates millennium. Is more along the lines of saying that they don't believe in the earthly millennial established kingdom that is laid out by most premillennialists. Okay, they do believe in the millennium, but they believe that the millennium, as laid out in Revelation 20, is symbolic of the time between Christ's first and second coming. between Christ's death, burial, and resurrection and ascension, and his second coming. So the present age. So the actual term 1,000 years is symbolic. Okay, so it's not a literal 1,000 years that we're dealing with here, which is completely opposite of what the premillennialists would believe, and saying that they would say that no, this is a literal 1,000 years. For 1,000 consecutive years, Christ is going to be on earth, and he's going to be reigning. So the amillennialists will say that the 1,000 years it represents the time, the present age, the time between Christ's first and second coming, and then Christ comes back after that point. So there you have a similarity to what you have with postmillennialists, and which really isn't surprising, because before amillennialism was even given that label, they were just considered postmillennialists. But over time there became a distinction, and I think you can see what the distinction is if you understand that amillennialists, opposite of what postmillennials believe that the world will increasingly get worse, and that's connected to things with what you see, for example, of what Jesus describes as the birth pains in his Olivet Discourse and that sort of thing. So instead of the widespread gospel success that will turn this world into almost paradise on earth, the amillennialists will believe that we'll have a more pessimistic outlook on that. So basically, the one main difference that you have between the amillennialists and the postmillennialists is the kind of outlook that one has. Amillennialism is the more pessimistic view. Postmillennialism is the more optimistic view. Also, a difference is that postmillennialists will, most of them will believe in there is 1,000 years of that millennium. When specifically that occurs, I think, is left up to question. But with amillennialists, again, it's not dealing with a literal 1,000 years. We're not talking about 1,000 consecutive years. It's symbolic of the time between Christ's first and second coming. The time that we're living in right now is the millennium. Okay, so those are the main views, and so you might be asking the question, okay, well, what particular millennial view do you hold to? And I told you that I would disclose that to you, and my view and the view that I hold is the third one that I described, the amillennial view, which shouldn't be, if you've been with us throughout the whole study of Revelation, and if you're somewhat familiar with the different millennial views, my identification as an amillennialist, wouldn't surprise you. It wouldn't surprise you at all. It also wouldn't surprise you if those of you who are listening right now have ordered my book, because in my book I lay out from the outset in the introduction of my book that I approach that from an amillennial perspective. So if you got the book and you read the book, you already knew before this time, coming into this time, that I lean. I don't lean towards. I actually embrace the amillennialist perspective. And believe it or not, just to share with you a little bit, I will admit that there's a certain part of me that has had difficulty at times, not all the time, but at certain times, just kind of revealing that about myself. And that's really actually more towards people that I know, not towards strangers. I don't know many of you who are listening to this, and you're offended by me being being an amillennialist. That doesn't faze me much. And I guess the reason why that is because a lot of very harsh and very unfair things have been said about amillennialists, even to the point where they've been called heretics. Hopefully, if you've been with me through this entire book of Revelation and studying this, that even the approach of this book isn't anything heretical. But things have been turned, as far as the millennium question has been concerned, has turned into a big nasty thing, and it really doesn't have to be that way. And And I guess part of the reason why there's somewhat of a skittish sort of way of approaching this at times, again, not all the time. I mean, I was willing to publicly lay that out in my book. But even with people that I know personally, who may not know where I stand and who say they're going to get the book, I think, okay, is this really going to affect the way that they look at me now and that sort of thing? I think that people's view of amillennialists have improved over the years, but there's staying power from a lot of premillennial teachers of old who I consider them brothers in Christ, and I believe that they're with the Lord in heaven. I look forward to reuniting with them when everything is all said and done. But I'm not gonna sugarcoat this here. There have been some of them, not all of them, okay, but there have been some of them who have done a lot of damage as it relates to drawing caricatures about the amillennial view, and that sort of thing that they've done still has staying power today. Now, again, like I said, I think that things are shifting a little bit where people don't look at it as much as a weird or heretical sort of outlook on the millennium, but you still have some people that do. And I think that that's the after effects of how things have been rolled out in the past, which is truly, truly unfortunate. And so, but it's weird though. I mean, this isn't to deny that people don't share those feelings about amillennialism and amillennialists today. But the thing that's strange about this is, what I still struggle with this thought, because I'm just kind of wondering, for those people who hold that sort of understanding about amillennialists, what do they think our angle is in supposedly, and I say supposedly because it's not true, but supposedly glossing over or manipulating the scriptures or intentionally allegorizing the text to escape this idea of a literal 1,000 years. What would be our motive for doing that? I'm not really even sure why they would think that we would have any sort of motive of doing that. What would be our angle of doing that? The way that the premillennial teaching is rolled out, with what their understanding is of the millennium, there's nothing in that teaching, even though we disagree with it, there's nothing in there that's offensive. In fact, it sounds very good. It sounds tremendous. So like, it's not like we would be trying to escape some sort of offensive teaching about what premillennialists say. It's also not, and again, it's not us denying anything of the eternal, denying anything of the heavenly or anything like that. Listen, once we get to Revelation 21 and it talks about the new heavens and the new earth, we're all about the new heavens and the new earth, which I would hope that amillennialists and premillennialists would agree is vastly superior to any sort of earthly 1,000-year millennial kingdom. Because in the 1,000-year earthly millennial kingdom, things aren't complete yet. The new heavens and the new earth hasn't been constructed, hasn't been created yet. And you still have a mass of Christians who have not received their glorified bodies. In the eternal state, in the new heavens and the new earth, you do have that. So that's superior. And we embrace that totally. 100. So it's not a matter of trying to dismiss anything of the heavenly or of the eternal, or anything like that. And it's certainly, and here's the thing, this would be an odd place to try and gloss over or try and manipulate scripture to kind of get it to say what we want it to say. What an odd place to kind of play those kind of games. If anything, we would, if there would be anything as far as trying to gloss over or change the meaning of any sort of scripture in the book of Revelation, you would think it would be in chapter 19, where judgment happens. You would think if there's anything offensive, it would be, the description of judgment in chapter 19. I don't know of any amillennialists who deny the judgment of God at his second coming in chapter 19. They say, yep, that's how it's going to happen. That's what's going to happen. God's going to judge the unbelievers when he comes back. And especially if you're looking at this from the perspective of recapitulation, again, that's, you come upon the topic of judgment in several places in the book of Revelation. And the amillennialists will certainly acknowledge that, and will acknowledge all of those judgment passages. So again, it brings us back to the question: what would be the motive? What's our angle in doing that? I mean, it's none of those things. But basically, what our whole idea is looking at the book of Revelation in a consistent way, and also based on its genre. And the genre of the book should inform us on how we should interpret the book of Revelation. That's really what it comes down to. So it's not a matter of trying to gloss over anything. It's just being consistent with the genre and with the way that interpretation of the book of Revelation has been unfolded throughout. And so if you've been with me from the beginning of this study of the book of Revelation, hopefully you've been able to see that. And so the way we're going to see Revelation 20 is really no different than what we've been looking at in any other passage in the book of Revelation. Okay, which really that brings into focus here, because I just mentioned recapitulation. There's a couple of things that we're going to need to have firmly established in our thinking in order for you to kind of track with me of where I'm going with this interpretation of Revelation. And they're familiar to you if you've been with me through this study before. Okay, but again, it's going to be important for us to review this. Okay, I just mentioned it a couple minutes ago, and that's recapitulation, where we're not dealing with a chronological, sequential look at end times events in the book of Revelation, starting in chapter 4. Okay, and hopefully, as we've gone through that, you've been able to see why that's the case. And the biggest case for that is just with the different passages that highlight the end. Things that we would see when Christ comes back. There's different visions of the end, okay? And that's because we're dealing with different visions that are cataloging a whole span of time between the first and second comings of Christ, or a portion of that time leading up to the end. And each of those visions have different symbolic figures, symbolic pictures, and different emphases in those particular visions. But again, just to remind you of where those visions are, you have in chapter 6, verses 12 through 17 is the first one. The second one is in chapter 11, verses 15 through 19. The third one is in Revelation chapter 14, verses 14 through 20. The fourth one is chapter 16, verses 17 through 21. And then the fifth one, which we just finished looking at over the last couple of episodes, is in chapter 19, verses 11 through 21. Okay. And so after each of those different visions of the end, and by the way, I would encourage you, and this is especially true for those if you haven't been with me through the whole episode, go back to those passages that I just referenced to see how those are catalogs of the end, okay? And how if you have these different, establishments of descriptions of the end in these different particular points in Revelation, it makes it hard to see the book of Revelation from chapter 4 all the way to the end as a sequential unfolding of things immediately preceding the second coming of Christ. That is mostly understood as a 7-year tribulation period. Okay, it's just hard to do that, and the reason why it would be hard to do that is because that's not how Revelation was meant to be read. That's not how it was written. That's not how the first century audience would have understood that, and they would have had a grasp on the genre of the book, and it wouldn't have been unusual to them, to read it in this way. Okay, so I would encourage you to go back to those passages and look at it yourself. But after those particular visions of the end, you have another vision, that catalogs a different description of things that happen between the first and second comings of Christ, and we've gone through all of that. And all of those things leading up to yet another description of the end from a different perspective, same event of the end, but this time, but in a different perspective or a different camera angle. Okay, and so that's what we're dealing with. So when we've come to chapter 19, again, that's what we're dealing with here. So once we get into chapter 20, we're not dealing with a sequence of what has happened at the end of chapter 19 and then leading into chapter 20. Okay. And that's why you have, at least from the premillennial side, the whole belief in premillennialism, because if you're looking at it from a sequential perspective, and if you see that Revelation 19 is the second coming of Christ, not so much the other passages that I laid out, but chapter 19 is the only description of the end when Christ comes back, then, and if you're reading this from a sequential perspective, then the next thing that you have is this description of the 1,000 years. So Christ comes back before the millennium, and if this is the millennium, that this is the millennium that happens on earth. Okay. And that's how they would look at it. But if we're looking at this through the lens of recapitulation, you see that this will make a little bit more sense, and I'll give you a specific example, as it relates to all of this here in a little bit. But one thing that's worth pointing out, and especially as it relates to chapter 20, because in chapter 20, just even how it starts out. Let me just read verses 1 through 3, because that's where we're going to be now and next time. But it's talking about, the beginning of the 1,000 years. And it says, then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit, and shut it, and sealed it over him, so that he might not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be released for a little while. Okay. Now, what I want you to make special note of is the description of the dragon. Okay. In verse 2, where it says, and he, which is the angel that we read about in verse 1, it says, and he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil and Satan. Now, the reason why I emphasize that is because that sort of language is used to describe the dragon again in chapter 12, and I believe it's in verse 9. Let's see. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who was called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. Okay, so there you have the similar language here. And we're supposed to have this idea, this understanding that Satan, we understand Satan depicted as a dragon here in both of these visions here, as one who deceives and who leads the whole world astray and that sort of thing. So you have here in Revelation chapter 12, the dragon being thrown down to earth. You have in chapter 20 the dragon being cast into the abyss. So there's similar language as far as a casting down of some sort. Now again, not all of the language is exact because we're using different symbolic language here and there, and it's supposed to give us different emphases and that sort of thing. But what's also of great interest, I think, at least to me anyway, if we're looking at chapter 12, and you have this whole thing of the dragon, who is Satan, who deceives the whole world, who's thrown down to the earth, and this angel's thrown down with him. Notice verse 10, where it says, and I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. Okay. Now notice again, it says, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God, and the authority of his Christ have come. Now the question is, what sort of kingdom are we dealing with here? Now, in chapter 20, we have the dragon, i.e. Satan, being thrown into the abyss. And then you have the whole thing, the description of verses 4 and following, where you have thrones are set up, and you have the saints of God who are ruling with Christ for 1,000 years, which would seem to indicate the rulership in a kingdom. So there again, you have, the similarities here. So I think in a certain sense, you do see recapitulation between what you see in chapter 12 and what you see in Revelation chapter 20. Now, the big question as it relates to the comparison between those two passages would be in chapter 12 when it's talking about the salvation and the power and the kingdom of God has come. It's saying like it's as if it's saying it's happening right now. The kingdom has at this time come, which if you are looking at this from a premillennial perspective, that's going to be a challenge to address, because if from the premillennial perspective we're looking at that Revelation in a sequential order here, and the happenings and the unfoldings of things that happened during a 7-year tribulation, then you have to ask the question, what kingdom has come in the middle of what we're supposed to be understanding as a 7-year tribulation, right? What kingdom are we talking about here? The kingdom is announced there. So what are we dealing with here? And just so you can understand, I would be one who would say that it's the kingdom that was established when Christ first came, and and after his death, burial, and resurrection, and everything like that. I mean, even before he left, he said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." Right? The kingdom did come, and it is here now. It is still to come. Also, that's the whole thing of the already and the not yet, right? We don't need to get into that specifically now, but the whole thing is that Christ brought the kingdom when he came, and the kingdom didn't go away. You even get a clue of that even with how Paul talks about the kingdom and that sort of thing. So, so if in Revelation, so that's how my understanding of it. And this is the kingdom that is the same kingdom that we see in Revelation chapter 20, which is cataloging the kingdom that exists between the first and second comings of Christ. Now, when Christ comes back, is the kingdom going to go away? No, the kingdom is still going to be firmly established. It's going to remain. And that's what the writer of Hebrews says in Hebrews chapter 12. But there is a kingdom that exists now. And I believe that that's what the kingdom is in Revelation chapter 12 when it says the kingdom has come. Now, if you're looking at this from a premillennial perspective, you have to ask a very difficult question. And I looked into what some premillennialists, dispensational premillennialists have said as far as explaining this whole thing of the kingdom in that passage in Revelation chapter 12. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read to you a footnote in my book. It's not the main text of the book, but it's a footnote that addresses this very thing about the kingdom in Revelation chapter 12, verse 10. And again, it goes to this very issue here of the kingdom and how, the premillennialists will look at this. And this is how I answer this. And it says, and I say, please note the present tense in Revelation 12:10. The kingdom has, and in parentheses, I say now, come. So the kingdom has now come. This is important because if the setting of this verse is during the tribulation, then what kingdom is John referring to here? Many dispensationalists, to preserve their premillennial understandings, will say that this is referring to the earthly millennial kingdom, but it is spoken in a forward-looking way. MacDonald said that this verse, quote, anticipates the millennial kingdom, end quote. And LaHaye said that the dragon's eviction from heaven to earth is the, quote, first giant step toward the eventual establishment of the kingdom of Christ, end quote. But there is nothing anticipatory or eventual about the kingdom in Revelation 12:10. Besides the, quote, the present tense language, we can't ignore the links that John uses to construct this verse. The kingdom has come because, or quote unquote for, in verse 10, Satan has been thrown down, which dispensationalists say happens during the tribulation. So if the kingdom has presently come because of an event that supposedly happens during the tribulation, then the dispensationalist is faced with a difficult quandary. If this is the millennial kingdom, then why does the dragon wreak havoc in verse 12 when the normal understanding of the millennium demands that Satan is locked away in the abyss and the earth has 100% peace during that time? We would also have to wonder why Satan's expulsion from heaven would have any positive effect on the supposed eventual millennial kingdom on earth. All of this should show us that we cannot manipulate the language of this verse in order to preserve premillennialism. The more accurate and sensible interpretation of this verse is that John is referring to the kingdom that Jesus brought and announced at his first coming and confirmed by his death, burial, resurrection, and ascension. Okay, and we'll stop right there. And of note there, and I'll just paraphrase this here. This is also in the footnote, is that this is interesting that this comes, following a description of what we see in chapter 12, verses 1 through 5, where we see the rapid moving ministry of Christ, where the Christ child is born and then he's ascended up to heaven to his throne. What's he going to be doing at the throne? He's going to be reigning there. Okay. And which results in the expulsion of Satan from heaven, right? And then it says the kingdom has come, right? So hopefully you see how those things are kind of fitting together. So there you had that whole thing of recapitulation. We see that specifically with chapters 12 and 20. But we also get a clue that recapitulation is happening when we compare the chronology or supposed chronology as it relates to Revelation 19 and 20. And this is one of the more hard-hitting arguments, I think, as it relates to why amillennialism would probably be the more would make more sense of interpreting Revelation 20 from an amillennial perspective than a premillennial perspective, when we understand that chronology between Revelation chapter 19 and Revelation chapter 20 doesn't work out very well. And this is one of the reasons. This is one of the main reasons why I thought it was very important not to take the break from Revelation at the end of chapter 19, because I want what we've looked at in chapter 19 to be fresh in our minds, so that we can see this kind of the disparity here in understanding of sequence and things like that between chapter 19 and chapter 20. Because what we saw, you'll remember in chapter 19 was a complete total destruction of unbelievers when Christ comes back. We saw Christ on the white horse and everything. It symbolizes his victory and everything like that. And we saw the gathering of the kings and rulers of the earth and things like that. And again, specifically, just to remind you, it says in verse 19, it says, and I saw the beast and the kings of the earth with their armies gathered to make war against him who was sitting on the horse and against his army. So those were the people who gathered together against Christ and his people. But let me remind you also that we're not just dealing with kings. We're not just dealing with mighty men or warriors and things like that. Again, let me just take you back to verse 18, in the middle of where the angel is inviting the birds of the air to come and feast on people's flesh, which would be the dead bodies of the people, who would come up against God. Because remember, it says they're invited to the great supper of God, verse 18, to eat the flesh of kings, the flesh of captains, the flesh of mighty men, the flesh of horses and their riders, and the flesh of, here it is, all men, both free and slave, both small and great. So we're getting a full comprehensive destruction here. The idea that we're supposed to get here is that, nobody's going to survive this. Nobody's going to escape. And in case there's any doubt of that, you just go into, verse 20, where it says that the beast and the false prophet were captured, and they were thrown alive into the lake of burning sulfur there. And then in verse 21 it says, and the rest were slain by the sword, and that came from the mouth of him who was sitting on the horse, and all the birds were gorged with their flesh. Okay, so that's pretty clear there that with this we're looking at a complete destruction of unbelievers there. There should be nobody left. When Christ comes back, he wipes out everybody. Not just the kings, not just the warriors, not just the generals, everything like that. Every man, all men, both slave and free, both small and great. Okay? So Now, if we're looking at this from a sequential perspective, okay, we're going into, chapter 20, which is, if we're looking at this from a premillennial perspective, this comes immediately after. And so with the description, and we just read it here a few minutes ago, Satan is bound and he's thrown into the abyss. Now, why is he thrown into the abyss, and why is it sealed over him? So that he might not deceive the nations any longer. Okay. Now, here's the question, though. What nations? What nations? Because what we just saw before in chapter 19 is that the nations were already destroyed. All the nations were destroyed, which would leave left there, just believers. Those are the only peoples who are left. And so when we get into chapter 20, we're told that, that the nations have to be protected from being deceived by Satan. But that really doesn't make any sense because there aren't any nations to deceive. Okay. So here's the thing, though. I can see a potential pushback to that to what I just said there, the challenge that I laid out there. And that would be, well, remember, Steve, that you do have people who are still in non-glorified bodies, and those are the Tribulation Saints. Now, I've already addressed the whole idea of Tribulation Saints in a past episode. I actually should have brought the episode number in the title so that you can go back and listen to that yourself. But I lay out I think pretty effectively from Scripture that there, from a premillennial standpoint, the whole idea of Tribulation Saints is impossible. I would strongly encourage you to go back and listen to that episode. I'll bring the episode number to that next time so that you can go back and listen to that at your own convenience. But that would be who would have to be in existence in order to have people in non-glorified bodies when Christ comes back in order to populate the earth. So, and if we're dealing with people who during that time are born as sinners, people aren't born into salvation in the millennium. Even though the environment is great and everything like that, the sinful nature still exists, according to the premillennial perspective. So the possible pushback that I see from this could be like, okay, but you have to understand that you will have people who, they'll still be born in sin, and so they would still be susceptible to deception. If the dragon, i.e. Satan, were still roaming around and everything like that. Which is, listen, again, aside from the fact that there aren't any such people as Tribulation Saints, the other thing that you have to understand is that actually the question that I would have is that, but do you still have people in the millennium? Granted, they might live for a lot longer time than they do in this present age right now, but do you still have people in the millennial kingdom who die? And if they die, are there people who die during the millennium without a saving relationship with Jesus Christ? All right. Does complete deception brought on by Satan totally eradicate people not seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ during that millennium? That would be a question that I would have, that I would pose to that. But more of a statement that I would like to make as far as it relates to people in glorified bodies in the kingdom and everything like that, is, we have to go back to what Scripture clearly states, particularly in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and specifically where, in verse 50, which is very familiar because this is an area where a lot of premillennialists will share this text as it relates to a pre-trib rapture. But it says, I tell you this, verse 50 of 1 Corinthians 15, it says, I tell you this, brothers, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. Okay. Now that in itself, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. Okay. And this is the kingdom having to do with the end. And even though the kingdom is now, the context of what Paul is writing about here is the kingdom that is fully and finally established at the end. And you might have some people who say, well, hold on there. That's talking about the kingdom after the actual temporary millennial kingdom. So you have the millennial kingdom, and then you have the eternal kingdom. And the eternal kingdom is what we're talking about there, where flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. It's that later kingdom. Well, first of all, there isn't any sort of distinction that Paul makes in the entire chapter of 1 Corinthians 15 that would lead you to the idea of there's the millennial kingdom, and then there's the eternal kingdom. And really, if you read 1 Corinthians 15 in a straight face value way, there's no way that you can read an earthly millennial kingdom into that text. You can't. There's no way that you can do that adequately. The kingdom that Paul is talking about is the same kingdom. And here's the thing: when we're talking about flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. Right after that, in verse 51, it says, "Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed." Now, that's the verse. Those are the verses that a lot of premillennialists will use to catalog the whole thing of a pre-trib rapture. Okay? Now, that happens, if that happens before a supposed 7-year tribulation period, there's the rapture, and then there's the resurrection of the body. Okay? And I do believe that will take place, right? And more on the rapture will be discussed probably sometime after we finish the book of Revelation. But he's connecting what happens at that time using verses that a lot of premillennialists will use to describe the rapture before what takes place at the millennium, at least 7 years previous to that. But if you take what Paul is saying there, he's saying flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. And the whole changing in the twinkling of an eye in verse 51 and 52 is what solves that problem. Okay? And so the kingdom that is so that a lot of people are referring to here, again, let me put it this way, and I don't want to get too much into the weeds here because I don't want to get too far off track here, but just look through 1 Corinthians 15, and when he talks about the kingdom, he talks about the kingdom at Christ's coming. When it talks about Christ coming, he talks about the kingdom at his coming. And then when Christ comes, he hands the kingdom over to God the Father. Now, there isn't any mention of an earthly millennial kingdom and that sort of thing. Nothing of that is taking place. And if we're talking about the resurrection that happens at his coming, notice there, you have the resurrection that happens at his coming. And then the kingdom. It all seems to lay out one event where the kingdom, once we have the kingdom, we have the eternal kingdom, which when Christ comes, we're not talking about 1,000-year millennial reign of Christ, but as you read in 1 Corinthians 15, Christ comes and then he hands the kingdom to God the Father at the end, because it says then the end comes. Okay? So then when you get to what I just read before, the whole thing of flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. Well, what kingdom? The kingdom at his coming, right? At the second coming of Christ. And what kingdom is that? An earthly millennial kingdom? No, it's the fully established, fully consummated kingdom, which, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, Christ hands over to God the Father. Okay? That's what we're dealing with here. Okay? So if we're going back to chapter 20 here, we have to understand, that, if we're looking at chapter 19, going into chapter 19, and then sequentially into chapter 20, it doesn't make any sense, because now we're saying that Satan is bound and he's cast into the abyss, so that he might not deceive the nations. But the nations have been destroyed. And we can't be talking about eventual nations that will be coming up from supposedly people in non-glorified bodies during an earthly millennium, because as we just seen, and I think 1 Corinthians 15 is the biggest answer to that question, is that that sort of thing isn't going to exist. That's not going to happen. So if this is a sequence from chapter 19 into chapter 20, what nations is being protected from being deceived from the dragon if they've been destroyed in chapter 19? Now, from the standpoint of recapitulation, it all makes sense because as we've been seeing all throughout the book, with recapitulation, you have a vision of the end, and then we go into another vision. Case in point, let me just point this out to you. After the first vision of the end in chapter 6, right? And let me read the passage there, what we read there. Of the first vision of the end in chapter 6, starting in verse 12, it says, "When he opened the sixth seal, I looked, and behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth, and the full moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth, as a fig tree sheds its winter fruit when shaken by a gale. The sky vanished like a scroll that is being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Then the kings of the earth and the great ones and the generals and the rich and the powerful and everyone slave and free hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains, calling on the mountains and the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand?" Notice that the day of their wrath has come. And all of this in connection to the dissolving of the first heavens and the first earth, which makes way for the new. Okay. But then when you go into chapter 7, it says, you kind of get into an interlude period before we get into, the actual next vision of what we see between the first and second comings of Christ. But, it says in chapter 7, it says, "After this, I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth, so that no wind might blow on earth or sea or against any tree." Which that's weird, just given what we've seen previous to that. And then verse 2, it says, "Then I saw another angel ascending from the rising of the sun with the seal of the living God, and he called with a loud voice to the 4 angels who had given him power to harm the earth and sea, saying, 'Do not harm the earth or the sea or the trees until we have sealed the servants of God,' so forth and so on." So there's a command not to harm earth and sea, but earth at least, at the very least, is being harmed at the end of chapter 6. So what are we dealing with here? Well, if you understand the principle of recapitulation in a book like Revelation, it becomes very clear. We're looking at another vision that leads up to the next vision of the end that we see in chapter 11. Okay, so that's how we should understand this. That's how we should look at this here. Okay, so in the same way we see complete total destruction in chapter 19. Now we're seeing things where things wouldn't make sense, looking at it from a sequential perspective, but they do make sense if you're looking at it in recapitulation. So when we come into chapter 20, what are we dealing with here? We're dealing with another vision, and it's another vision just like the other visions that we've seen in chapter 19, in the books of Revelation, that deal with another vision, cataloging a picture from a different perspective, a different angle, describing things between the first and second comings of Christ and how those things roll out that lead up to the second coming of Christ at the end. And by the way, spoiler alert, there is going to be a 6th vision of the end. We're going to see that in verses 7 through 10 of chapter 20. Okay. But that's how we see that there. This only makes sense if we're seeing this consistent pattern of recapitulation. And again, this is what I said. This is what the angle is of the amillennialist. The amillennialist isn't trying to gloss over anything. All they're trying to do, and all I'm trying to do, is be consistent with the interpretation of what we've been doing throughout the whole book of Revelation. And really, when you look at it, it makes proper sense in that way. It doesn't make sense if you look at it from the premillennial perspective in doing all of this. Okay, and one of the problems that we see here as it relates to all of this is because if we look at it the way that I've been describing it here, then there's the accusation of you're not taking the scripture literally and that sort of thing. And that's the second thing that I want to touch up on, that we've touched upon several times before, but it's going to be important for us to talk about now as we get into chapter 20, is this whole idea of literal interpretation versus looking at things symbolically. Okay. Now, if you've been with me throughout this entire study of the book of Revelation, you know that a lot of what we've seen and a lot of what I've interpreted has been looked at from a symbolic point of view. Not saying that the realities that they point to are themselves symbolic. We talked about this last week, and I want to remind you again because it's so important to understand this, is that, and let me just use the second coming as the obvious example. Nobody, not even the staunchest amillennialist, is saying that the second coming of Christ is allegorical. In other words, that, Christ isn't going to literally, bodily, and physically return to earth. Oh, that's just allegorical. No, that's not what what's the symbolic allegorical approach to this means. That's been woefully misinterpreted and misrepresented, and I wish people wouldn't do that. No, Christ and his return to earth, physically, bodily, to judge sin, to make all things new, that sort of thing, is all real and it's literal. That's something that we all look forward to. The way that it's described, though, in the book of Revelation is symbolic. I don't think Christ is literally when he comes, is going to be riding a white horse. That's symbolic language to talk about the victory that he holds when he comes to destroy his enemies. And the reason why I say that is because Jesus gives his own description of what his appearance at his second coming is going to be when he comes back, and none of it involves a horse. But if we look at Revelation for what it was meant to be, then we can more readily embrace the whole thing of, oh, this is symbolic language as far as the appearance of Christ at that time. So the second coming is literal, but the symbols that point to that reality, those are the things that, there's symbolic pictures that point forward to that reality that kind of gives the picture more of a vivid understanding. Okay, does that make sense? So that's what we have to deal with there. So with literal interpretation, here's the thing. I think that there can be a tendency on the dispensational side to take literal interpretation too far. And I'll give you a couple of examples of it. One where it's not really something where I say you're taking things too far, but one where if we just compare scripture with scripture, we see that looking at things allegorically or symbolically isn't out of place. But then the other one where, if we approach Revelation, militantly with a literal or possible hermeneutic, you end up making a lot of silly mistakes. Now, let's use the first example here as it relates to what we're looking at in Revelation chapter 20, and that's the 1,000 years, okay? The premillennial side will say, 1,000 years, that is literally 1,000 years. To say that somehow it represents the, things having to do with things between the first and second comings of Christ is just silly. That's ludicrous. 1,000 years means 1,000 years. Okay. Why try and spiritualize or allegorize and that sort of thing, so forth and so on. And listen, I think I disclosed this to you last time. I used to believe in dispensational premillennialism, and that was one of the thoughts that I had about amillennialism. Okay. My question was, how in the world can you take 1,000 years and interpret that to mean, oh, that's just symbolic of talking about the first and second, the things happening between the first and second comings of Christ. And my whole reaction was, that's kind of ridiculous. But with a little bit more study and a little bit more guidance and just kind of understanding where amillennialists are coming from, you kind of understand, well, it's not all that far off after all. Again, the rock bed foundation of this is understanding what kind of genre you're dealing with when you're talking about a book like Revelation. If you look at the book of Revelation as something that is supposed to be seen from symbolic to reality, let's just put it that way, then embracing the 1,000 years as symbolic language of a long period of time between the first and second comings of Christ doesn't seem too far-fetched. And it also doesn't seem too far-fetched when we understand that not only in Revelation, but in other parts of Scripture, the number 1,000 itself is used in passages that aren't meant to be taken literally, and the average reader doesn't take them literally. At least I don't hear any arguments for taking them literally. And I think the case in point example of this you can find in Psalm 50, verse 10, where it says, "For every beast of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know all the birds of the hills, and all that moves in the field is mine." Now, question: is the term 1,000 hills, is that literal? Are we to understand that after the 1,000th hill, the thousandth, that's hard to say, the 1,000th and first hill, that's very hard to say, and it sounds silly with me trying to say it. The 1,000th and first hill does not belong to God. Is that how we're to understand that? No, and any average reader doesn't understand. I've never run into anybody that would understand it that way. We correctly understand that's not how that's supposed to be interpreted. And really what we see in verse 10, we have a clue as to what is meant by 1,000 hills. For every beast of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. And even in verse 11, I know all the birds of the hills. So the thousands is meant to depict either a large number or a comprehensive, all or many or all, that sort of thing. Again, if you were to look at, Deuteronomy as another example, Deuteronomy chapter 7, I think you might know where I'm going with this here. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 9. "Know therefore that the Lord your God is God, the faithful God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations." Okay. Now, is he meaning keeping his the 1,000th generation, that at the 1,000th and first generation, then that whole thing is cut off? No. And especially if we're talking about generations, and if we use the standard understanding of 40 years as a generation, take that times 1,000, take that times 1,000, you understand that there's hyperbolic language here used to talk about many or all, or a substantial number of things here. And in this case, it's generations. Okay, but again, we don't question those in passages like that. Again, if we were to go back to Psalms again, and in Psalm 89, and in let's see, in verse 10, let me find it here. I flip back a page. Psalm 89, verse 84 is what I meant to say. Psalm 84, verse 10. "For a day in your courts is better than 1,000 elsewhere." Okay. So how are we to understand this? Are we to understand that the psalmist here literally means that, that there are 1,000 literal other places that would be not worthwhile to be at as compared to a day in your courts? In other words, I can think of 1,000 literal places where it would not be as good as it would be if we were spending one day in your courts. No, we understand that the use of 1,000 there means many or large or all. I mean, again, just depending on the context or what you're dealing with there. And then, of course, I think you realize, again, you might recognize the, another more well-known reference to 1,000, and that's in 1 Peter chapter 3, where he says in verse 8, "But do not overlook this one fact, beloved, that with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day." Now, is he meaning literally that 1 day on earth feels literally like 1,000 days up in heaven to the Lord? No, that's not what he's saying. Again, because as he goes on to say, he's exercising patience so that people can come to repentance before he comes back. That's the whole thing. So the context of his patience, he's using the 1,000 years to communicate in a figurative way that I'm waiting a long time so that there can be as much opportunity for people to come to repentance. Again, 1,000 equals many, long, large, or in some cases all, okay? And these things aren't disputed. So, but all of a sudden, though, here's the point that I'm trying to make here. All of a sudden, when we come to 1,000 years, we're told, no, it has to be 1,000 literal years. And if you're not, then you're not reading scripture literally. And so you're allegorizing it and making it into whatever you want it to be. Listen, in those other passages, if we can readily acknowledge the figurative language that's used there in those passages in books where, we're not even talking about a genre like Revelation. If we can look at it in a figurative way in those books, how much more can we look at it in a book like Revelation when we're surrounded by symbols, where numbers themselves have symbolic significance? We've seen it. We've seen it time and again, especially with numbers like 7, a number of completeness, 10, another number of completeness, 12, and its multiples. And talking about the complete people of God. I mean, we've come upon numbers before with symbolic meaning. Why can't 1,000 years fit the same thing? And why can't it mean very likely the same thing? Have the same understanding as we have of the number 1,000 in other parts of Scripture. So I don't see how there's this hard and fast rule with the book of Revelation where it says you have to interpret 1,000 years literally as 1,000 literal consecutive years in a kingdom. But with those other ones, we understand those are meant figuratively. But look, in Revelation, we're dealing with figures and symbols all over the place, right? Okay, so that would be my one thing. And so the 1,000 years, again, is meant to catalog a long period of time, large, which of course is something that we've seen between the first and second comings of Christ. Okay, and so that's my whole thing there. Now, the other example, and I'll outlay this quickly as I can, and then we'll close, is this whole idea of the chain. Now, the chain and the dragon and Satan being bound and everything like that, what all of that means, and everything, we're gonna go deeper into that specific part of that next time. But I just want to make a highlight here just to kind of set the stage for that and to use this as an example of how literal interpretation in the book of Revelation can go too far. Okay? Because we, again, as we go into chapter 20, we see an angel coming down from heaven holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. Okay? Now, in verse 2, it says, and he sees the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years and threw him into the pit and shut it and sealed it over him so that he might not deceive the nation, all of that sort of thing. So here's the thing. Here's what I've heard. This whole thing of Satan being bound and cast into an abyss, it's a literal abyss, and Satan is literally bound up with a literal chain, is how I've heard things described. I lay this out, and I didn't search through. I didn't pick out the page number in my book, but if I could, maybe I'll do this next time. I quote John Wolford, who's probably was considered a champion in dispensational premillennial understanding of the end times. Quoting from him, insisting that the chain that we see here in Revelation 20 is literal. It is an actual, and the sense that you get is that he's responding to people on the other side who are saying that we're seeing things symbolically here. I mean, even with the chain itself, he's insisting that the chain is a literal physical chain, which Satan is really going to be literally bound up with. Okay. Now, hopefully, as I'm saying this, you automatically hear the, no disrespect, but the utter ridiculousness of that thought. Right? You're seeing that, right? I hope so, because, if you have, here's the one thing that Wolford, had said as well. He says, I think there's 4 other places in the New Testament where the Greek word for chain that's used in Revelation 20 is used in other places in the New Testament. And his whole idea is, that we take it literally there. So there's no reason to not look at it literally here. Folks, and I lay this out in the book, is that, the other places where that Greek word is used, and yes, we can understand that literally because it's used in historic narrative. There's no reason to look at it in an allegorical or symbolic sense. We're having a story that's told to us, and we're being told in the story what happened in a literal, actual historical event. Not apocalyptic genre or literature or anything like that. So the genre doesn't call us to interpret the chain in those other passages in a symbolic sort of way. Okay? So again, it comes back to genre. We're dealing with a totally different animal as it relates to the book of Revelation. Okay? And so, of course, and see, that's just like saying like when Jesus healed the blind man, I believe it's in John chapter 9, when he touched his eyes and he healed his eyes, rubbed mud on his eyes and everything like that. The Greek word for that is the same. The Greek word for eyes is the same Greek word that's used in Revelation when it says that the Lamb has eyes all around him. So just because the same Greek word is used, does that mean that we are to say that our Savior literally has literal eyes all around him? And I use that example because I know that even from dispensational premillennial people, they don't take that literally. They understand that's symbolic. But if we go by that logic, by the logic of what Walvoord says with the chain, why not do that with anything else in the book of Revelation when compared to other books in the New Testament? You see what I'm saying? So that sort of reasoning doesn't fly. It doesn't really work very, very well for you. But here's another reason why the whole literal chain here is problematic. Because again, what we have to understand here, yes, we have Satan in view here, but he's depicted in the symbolic picture of a dragon. The dragon is not literal. He is a symbolic, figurative picture. Satan is real. The picture of the dragon points to the reality who is Satan, right? Now, what's happening to the dragon? The dragon is being bound in a chain. So the binding of the dragon with the chain is just a continuation of the symbolic picture that we're talking about here. Okay? Now, if we understand who we're dealing with as it relates to Satan, is Satan a physical being or is he a spiritual being? Right? I mean, is Satan a physical or spiritual being? I think almost everybody would readily say that Satan is not a physical being. He's spirit. He's a spiritual being. So my question is this: how are you going to take a chain, which people are insisting is a literal chain? How are you going to take a literal physical chain and bind up a spiritual being like Satan? How does that even work? That doesn't work. It doesn't work. So again, we understand we have, that's where you can see how when we especially when it comes to the book like Revelation, when we approach Revelation with this militant whole thing of we have to interpret everything literally, we see how that can go too far. And we can tread into the territory of the nonsensical. Okay? What we're seeing here is a symbolic picture here of what happens to Satan during the 1,000 years. And the 1,000 years, the number 1,000 itself being symbolic. Now, with all of these symbolic things going on, the dragon representing Satan, we know that he's bound. I mean, Satan himself isn't bound with a chain. Something happens with Satan that's pictured from the picture of a dragon being put into chains. So what does that represent? And the 1,000 years. What does it have to do with the 1,000 years between the first and second comings of Christ? And that yields big questions on the other side. Because if we're approaching this whole thing of what we're seeing about the dragon, i.e. Satan, and the chain and being locked away in the abyss and everything like that from a figurative and symbolic perspective, and really with the whole thing of saying how, I'll just let the cat out of the bag, is saying how Satan doesn't have, doesn't have influence to keep from the spread of the gospel and everything like that. The whole thing of the binding of Satan is just really causes a lot of problems. We say that that's symbolic of something. People think that we're saying that, let me put it this way. I'm stumbling with my words here. Let me put it this way. It all comes down to an understanding of what is meant by bound, and even what's meant by deception, because the reason why he's bound is to keep from deceiving the nations any longer. Now, people hear the word bound. Satan's bound. He's thrown away. He's locked away in the abyss. That to them signifies that he is kept from doing any sort of spiritual activity whatsoever. Any sort of spiritual activity. So when it comes to this passage here in Revelation 20, and we look at it from an amillennial perspective and say this is symbolic, they say, well, okay, but it says that Satan is bound. And to me, it looks like Satan is doing his work, and he's doing it well, unfortunately. So how do you get around that? You have to explain how you can still say that Satan is bound, but yet he seems to be active to me. And even the go-to verse for a lot of people is 1 Peter 5, where it says that our enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion seeking somebody to devour. And people say, that doesn't sound like somebody who's bound to me. So you're going to have to explain that. What do you guys mean? I mean, I'm talking the words of a premillennialist. What do you amillennialists believe when it says that Satan is bound? Because I don't see any other way of Satan being bound, but yet he's doing all of this negative stuff in the world, and he has been all throughout human history. What do you mean by that? Well, I'm glad you asked, and that's what we're going to get into next time. We're going to talk about what I believe and what many other amillennialists believe is being referred to as it relates to Satan being bound, what that means for the present age, and what that means for the gospel of Jesus Christ in the present age between the first and second comings of Christ. Okay. And also just kind of meeting some of the challenges that we would have to face if we were looking at this from a premillennial perspective, and how theologically their understanding of the binding of Satan doesn't make theological sense. And we'll talk about that as well. So this is what I was talking about before as far as deconstructing some areas, but kind of reconstructing others. It's kind of what we're dealing with here. And so as we leave here, I'm just going to ask you, because again, the whole thing of deception, because again, if Satan is bound, people are thinking, oh, he's not going to be able to deceive anybody because he's not anywhere to be seen. But yet we know that he's deceiving people now. So how can you make heads or tails of that from an amillennial perspective? Really, if you look at the whole Millennium text, it's really not that hard to figure out. And so here's your homework assignment from now until next time. And if you read my book already, then you already know where I'm going with this. So you're exempt from the homework assignment. But here's your homework assignment. Consider and read, several times, however many times you see fit, verses 1 through 10 of the Millennium passage, and see if you can figure out anything in that text that jumps out that would make the deception question, the deception problem, an obviously not problem. That's a funny way of putting it. Is there anything that you would see that jumps out of the text that would make the challenge to the deception question an obviously not problem? That's worded weird. That's worded weird. Basically, what I'm saying is there anything that you can see in your reading and examination of verses 1 through 10 that would jump out where you would say, okay, now I see how this isn't a problem now from the amillennial perspective as it relates to that. So between now and then, read through a few times the verses there in Revelation chapter 20 and see if that obvious answer to that challenge jumps out at you. And then we'll talk about it next time. Okay. All right. So we went much longer than I originally anticipated we would. Okay. But still some good things, I think. And hopefully you'll find this profitable. So We will leave it there for now. And like I said, next time we'll go into the whole thing of talking about what binding of Satan looks like for 1,000 years and everything, what that means from an amillennial perspective. Okay. So we'll leave it there for now. If you enjoy the show and you haven't done so already, I would encourage you to subscribe to my show on Apple Podcasts, also on iHeartRadio, YouTube, and Spotify. And also follow me, Steve Gill, on Twitter. My handle is @LTScripts. That's LTSCRIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scriptures. And also don't forget to order a copy of my book, Signs of the End. What did Jesus say about his own return and the events that point to it? Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. I'll leave a link in the episode description so that you click there, go to the order page on Amazon and order yourself a copy. All right. Well, it was good to kind of lay this foundation. I hope it wasn't burdensome or tedious or anything like that. But just so you can understand the initial thoughts that go into this, so that you can understand where I, as an amillennialist, am coming from going into something like Revelation chapter 20. Okay, and we got a lot more things to go, just as far as it relates to making heads or tails of this passage. Okay, so anyway, my name is Steve Gill, and I will see you right back here next time. Bye now.